Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at the account of Charlotte Fox written for American Alpine Journal in 1997. It had originally started out as part of a larger piece on the rope fixing operations on May 10, 1996, but that video was getting too long, so I decided to break it out and keep the videos to a more manageable size. So this video will take a look at various issues with rope fixing, then get into Charlotte Fox's account published in American Alpine Journal. I will then also cover the fact that the predetermined turnaround time for Rob Hall's group was 1 p.m. and briefly go through how Krakauer modified a key quotation in his process of switching the time to 2 p.m., which is what most people are today familiar with. The theory of the rope fixing is that, contrary to popular belief, very little rope fixing took place on May 10th, and people were not sitting around waiting for ropes to be fixed for any significant amount of time. The general explanation for what happened on May 10th is rather simple. There was a storm. But that rather simple fact somehow gets overlooked in all of Krakauer's discussions about waiting on ropes that never actually got fixed, blaming it on giant crowds that do not show up in any of the photographs, and of course that Lobsang was too tired from dragging Sandy Pittman up the mountain, and he was apparently the only one between the three expeditions that was capable of fixing ropes. In terms of the weather, on May 9th, substantially similar events unfolded. A Montenegrin team made their final summit attempt on May 9th, leaving at 1:30 a.m. A total of 6 people set out from South Col, 3 climbers from what was then Yugoslavia, and 3 Sherpa. The group had made a previous attempt on May 4th, but turned around after only about 200 meters because of high winds and, quote, Sherpas very tired from carrying loads. Then on May 9th, a group of 3 headed out with 3 Sherpa. The Montenegrins were solid climbers, but had no previous high-altitude experience. They fixed the ropes on a portion above South Col, or more accurately, their Sherpa fixed the rope. Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air has a very curious way of describing this. The Montenegrins, who had gotten even higher, had installed some fixed line, but in their inexperience, they'd used all they had in the first 1,400 feet above the South Col, wasting it on relatively gentle slopes where it wasn't really needed. Now, this passage has caused much confusion because people have taken it to mean that the Montenegrins fixed the first 1,400 feet of the route. That is not actually what it says. Krakauer is just writing in a loose style, and rather than saying exactly where the fixed ropes began and exactly where they ended, he just generalizes, and all it is saying is that they used all the rope somewhere in the first 1,400 feet. First, it is highly unlikely they used all their rope. The Montenegrins turned around at the base of the Hillary Step at 1 p.m. because of high winds, and it was too late in the day. They had encountered a developing storm that afternoon and were only able to drag themselves back into camp after dark. It is not clear where Krakauer heard that they had used all their rope on the lower section, but it does not appear anywhere in their report in the Himalayan database, and likely Krakauer invented it out of thin air. Krakauer frequently does this. He belittles other people so that he looks better, when in fact he is really just insulting himself. First, the Montenegrins exhibited the highest skill of mountaineering in that they turned themselves around when extremely close to the summit because conditions were worsening. Second, the Montenegrins managed to get to the base of the Hillary Step, so whatever ropes they fixed were clearly adequate to reach that position. And yet, there is big Jon Krakauer crying about the lack of ropes prior to the Hillary Step when he just said a bunch of inexperienced climbers were able to get there the day before. In the end, no ropes were fixed between the south summit and the base of the Hillary Step, and Krakauer and the others just used ropes from previous seasons, just the way the Montenegrins did. In his postscript, Krakauer appeared to still be suffering from hypoxia years after he climbed Everest when he wrote, After the expedition, Lobsang insisted that at the last minute Hall and Fisher had simply scrapped the plan to fix ropes in advance of their clients because they'd received erroneous information that the Montenegrins had already completed the job as high as the south summit. But if Lobsang's assertion is correct, neither Beitelman, Groom, nor Bukrev, the 3 surviving guides, were ever told of the altered scheme. And if the plan to fix the lines had been intentionally abandoned, there would have been no reason for Lobsang and Andorje to depart with the 300 feet of rope that each Sherpa carried when they set out from Camp 4 at the front of their respective teams. But Krakauer had just written that the inexperienced Montenegrins had indeed reached the base of the Hillary Step, which is above South Summit. So how was the information erroneous? More curious is that the Montenegrins had reached the base of the Hillary Step. It should be fairly clear that they did not fix the rope up the Hillary step nor at any point above that. You would want to fix the Hillary step with new rope, regardless of how many ropes from previous expeditions were there. And the area directly above the Hillary step is a little steep, so you'd want to fix that too. So there was a perfectly good reason to bring additional rope, even though the Montenegrins had fixed whatever rope was necessary to reach the base of the Hillary step. Krakauer is very dismissive of all the Sherpa, and his comment was directed at Lobsang, who had died shortly after this exchange took place. Lobsang was thus not able to point out the obvious flaw in Krakauer's reasoning. There was no reason to send any rope fixers in front of anyone, because tying some rope into existing anchor points on Hillary step and the slope above would only slow someone down about 15 or 20 minutes. In the case of fixing the area above the Hillary step, we know exactly how much it slowed someone down. Krakauer didn't fix the ropes, and he reached the summit at 1:12 p.m. That is past the predetermined turnaround time for Rob Hall's team. Neil Beitelman did fix the ropes above the Hillary step, and he arrived at 1:25. Thus, in fixing the ropes, it slowed Neil Beitelman down by just 13 minutes. This leaves us with the Montenegrins having turned around at 1 p.m., and yet still being short roped back into high camp at 10 p.m. That is, it took them a full 9 hours to descend from the base of the Hillary step, and the only reason they were able to pull themselves back into camp, or have the Sherpas pull them back into camp, was that the wind had let up at 7:30. Rather than providing the analysis of the events of May 9th, Krakauer only belittles the Montenegrins and their Sherpa because it doesn't fit his narrative. With only 6 total climbers, you could hardly say that there were crowds. They had their Sherpas to fix the ropes where needed, and they just used the ropes from previous seasons everywhere else. So there was no waiting on fixed ropes. They turned around at 1 p.m., so no issue with ignoring a turnaround time. And there was no Yugoslavian version of Sandy Pittman, and there were no guides climbing without oxygen. And yet, the only reason their entire team was not killed was that the wind died down at 7:30 p.m. on May 9th, and even then it still took them 2.5 hours to make it back to high camp after the wind had let up. On May 10th, the storm simply never let up. Thus, blaming crowds and fixed ropes is a bit disingenuous when the exact same situation occurred just the day before, and none of those were issues. So when I say the issue was not the fixed ropes, and I say the issue was not the so-called crowds, is because those were not issues. The primary issue for the Mountain Madness team, other than the storm, was the amount of time they spent on the summit. I'd previously noted that Lena Galmagard had written in her book, Climbing High, that some sort of stunt was planned on the summit. Although Galmagard wrote about it on 2 separate occasions in her book, and specifically stated that Lobsang was staying on the summit to do whatever the prank was, because Krakauer did not write about it in Into Thin Air, people have remained skeptical of Galmagard's account. However, in Charlotte Fox's account, she describes what she did once she was on the summit and was waiting for Tim Madsen to arrive. When Tim arrived behind a slow pack, I told Neil I was going down. There wasn't much time for an extended celebration, but Neil wanted to keep our group together. Minutes ticked by as we waited for the last of our team to arrive, have their photographs taken, and shake hands all around. I didn't look at my watch again when we finally did leave, and because of the timeless feeling that accompanies high-altitude climbing, I have no idea how long we were on the summit. That was also not reported by Krakauer. Instead, Krakauer has the opposite. It is Beitelman who had to pry the climbers off the summit. Exactly what the stunt was remains a mystery, but it seems Fisher wanted the clients there for some reason. Scott Fisher had not climbed with the group the entire day, so it is not clear what keeping the group together even meant. By 2:30, all the Mountain Madness clients had reached the summit, and the only person they were waiting for was Scott Fisher. Even if there was no stunt planned, asking clients to wait on the summit for Scott Fisher to show up was equally irresponsible. Krakauer leaves all of that out and instead has Beitelman dragging the clients off the summit. At 3:10 Friday afternoon, Fisher still having a ride on the top, says Beitelman, adding, "I decided it was time to get the hell out of there, even though Scott hadn't showed up yet." He gathered up Pittman, Galmagard, Fox, and Madsen and started leading them down the summit ridge. And I demonstrated in the video analyzing this photo, the group clearly did not leave the summit together, because that is Sandy Pittman, well in front just 10 minutes later. Instead, Pittman was in front because she left prior to the others. Galmagard also reports leaving after the other members of her team had already left. Krakauer not only leaves out those important details, but he also gets the details he put in completely wrong. I will also point out that this is not the first time Krakauer has left out an important piece of information in one of his books. In this 2014 article from NPR, author Helen McAlpin notes that Krakauer's Into the Wild was, quote, compromised by Krakauer not reporting key information at the request of his primary source. And if you have read Into Thin Air, you know that Krakauer's primary source for the events on the Mountain Madness team was Neil Beitelman, despite both Lena Gammelgard and Charlotte Fox publishing their own versions that agree with each other's accounts but differ significantly from the version used by Krakauer. Though both of those were women, so it should be little surprise that Krakauer would ignore anything they had to say. Turning back to Fox's account, a key point in the upcoming rope fixing video is that people were not waiting on South Summit for the ropes to be fixed. They were waiting for the oxygen to be brought up. Although this can be inferred from the other accounts, Charlotte Fox says it outright. We waited again while most people arrived at our small sheltered nook under the South Summit. All were due for the last bottle of oxygen at this point, which we would use to summit and descend to South Col, to be delivered by the Sherpa staff. I recall some discussion about the possibility of more rope to fix the narrow ridge in the Hillary Step. After waiting for more than an hour, the oxygen bottles finally arrived and someone produced just enough rope for Anatoly to fix the step. The ridge up to it had some old exposed lines that would have to suffice. I'll come back to the oxygen situation with the Mountain Madness team in a future video as Bukrev provides a little more details in the climb. But sticking to rope fixing, Fox is clear she was waiting for the oxygen to be brought up, and even if every inch of rope had been fixed to the summit, she needed the oxygen to get there. Although this is strongly implied in Into Thin Air, Krakauer muddles it up by focusing on some debate about who was going to fix the rope. The final section of rope fixing took less than a half hour total. This type of rope fixing in general was not complicated because they did not have to place any additional snow pickets or anchors. The only way anyone fixed ropes that day was tying into already existing anchor points. The work in fixing ropes was carrying the rope up from high camp in order to be fixed, not actually tying it in. You do have to use the correct knots and make sure the anchors that you are using are the good ones, and while these things do require some skill and experience, they do not take a large amount of time to actually perform. Charlotte also mentions that she waited for some indeterminate period of time for the rope to be fixed up the Hillary Step, but based on this photo taken at about 1 p.m. and Bukrev leaving the South Summit at 12 p.m., it is clear that any such delay was rather short, likely 15 minutes or so. It should be noted that Fox also confirms that the new ropes were not fixed along the traverse between the South Summit and the Hillary Step. I had previously mentioned this in the analysis of Scott Fisher's photo from South Summit, and people in the comments questioned whether this was indeed true. This misperception is a result of the literary technique Krakauer uses throughout his book, namely innuendo. He will state things that imply something took place, but when you look closely, he never actually says it took place. The rope fixing to the Hillary Step is an example. Here, Krakauer is waiting at South Summit. A little higher, seemingly no more than a stone's throw away, was the vertical gash of the Hillary Step, and slightly beyond that, the summit itself. Rendered dumb with awe and fatigue, I took some photos and sat down with guides Andy Harris, Neil Beitelman, and Anatoly Bukrev to wait for the Sherpas to fix the rope along the spectacularly corniced summit ridge. This sort of implies that he is waiting there for the ropes to be fixed leading towards the Hillary Step. However, the summit ridge starts above the Hillary Step, and it's not even clear whether he is referring to the actual summit ridge or the ridge traverse between South Summit and the Hillary Step. Now, Beitelman had already fixed some of the very short sections of rope below South Summit, but they also used ropes from previous seasons in that the rock section below South Summit. Krakauer offers no explanation as to why Beitelman would not continue to fix the ropes. Krakauer then jumps into his nonlinear storing technique and goes into a rant about Bukrev climbing without oxygen, but if you just skip all of that, you get, growing alarmed at the crowd stacked up at the South Summit, Beitelman roused Harris and Bukrev and strongly suggested that the three guides install the ropes themselves. Hearing this, I quickly volunteered to help. Beitelman pulled a 150-foot coil of rope from his pack. I grabbed another coil from Ann Dorje, and with Bukrev and Harris, we got underway at noon to fix the lines up the summit ridge. But by then, another hour had already trickled away. So Beitelman was sitting with 150 feet of rope in his backpack, wondering why the Sherpas were not fixing the ropes. What was he planning on doing with the rope? Carry it to the summit and leave a coil of rope on the summit? And of course, Krakauer is again using innuendo about where the ropes were going to be fixed. He simply said they got underway fixing the rope, but that just means they started walking over to where they would eventually start fixing the ropes. You can do the math. They have 2 coils of 150 feet of rope. The straight line distance between South Summit and Hillary Step is 280 feet. Thus, had they actually fixed the ropes along the traverse, they would have had no rope to fix the Hillary Step nor anything above along the summit ridge. Instead, they fixed the rope up the Hillary Step, and the additional section of rope was fixed on the ridge above the step, which exhausted their supply. So the ropes along the traverse to the Hillary Step were never fixed, nor was there any plan to ever fix them. They clearly knew they only had 300 feet of rope at South Summit, and although the straight line distance is 280 feet, with the ups and downs and the fact that you can't pull the rope taut, there was never any way they were going to fix the ropes along the traverse. Nor does Krakauer ever say that they did. He just uses innuendo to imply that it was done. As a note, Groom was carrying some rope that he would later use to short rope Beckweather down the mountain, but this appears to have been his personal rope that he brought for just such an occasion. Groom wrote that he was specifically told by Rob Hall not to engage in rope fixing, so whatever rope he had, it was never intended to be used to fix the ropes. Now, in terms of why Ann Dorje didn't fix the rope, the major point comes to this turnaround time, and that needs to be clarified. As the Mountain Madness team left high camp about 45 minutes after the Adventure Consultants team, they were using a different turnaround time, 2 p.m. as opposed to Adventure Consultants' 1 p.m. Not all the Mountain Madness teams report remembering any definite turnaround time, but Charlotte Fox recounts it as being 2 p.m., and Beitelman recounted 2 p.m. when being quoted in Into Thin Air. The Adventure Consultant team members were in agreement that their turnaround time was 1 p.m. Michael Groom writes on page 279 that the turnaround time was 1 p.m. Lou Kosiski, in After the Wind, goes into a detailed explanation of how the time was arrived at, and then bluntly states on page 125, Rob set the turnaround time for 1 p.m. And again on page 163. Actually, our turnaround time was a line already drawn. There was nothing invisible about 1 p.m. And Stu Hutchinson stated it was 1 p.m. in Krakauer's own Outside Magazine article. So where does the 2 p.m. turnaround time for Rob Hall's team come from? Well, clearly Rob Hall did not enforce the 1 p.m. turnaround, but no one ever says he then moved it to 2 p.m., which he also clearly did not enforce. It is curious that in some of the comments that so many people ardently believe there was a set 2 p.m. turnaround time for Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants group, but no one ever says there was. Let's look at what Krakauer says. At base camp before our summit bid, Hall had contemplated 2 possible turnaround times, either 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. He never declared which of these 2 times we were to abide by, however, which was curious considering how much he talked about the importance of designating a hard deadline and sticking to it no matter what. And then, by mid-morning on May 10, Hall still hadn't announced what our turnaround time would actually be. Hutchinson, conservative by nature, was operating on the assumption that it would be 1 p.m. And just 2 sentences later, Krakauer is quoting Hutchinson, and he is not making any assumptions. The turnaround time is just 1 p.m. It seemed increasingly unlikely that we would have any chance of summiting before the 1 p.m. turnaround time, says Hutchinson. I will get back to that quote from Stu Hutchinson shortly, but then just 22 pages later, a 2 p.m. turnaround time magically appears out of thin air. From the summit, a bump in the ridge blocks one's view of the rest of the route, and by 2, the designated turnaround time, there was still no sign of Fisher or the other clients. Beitelman began to grow concerned about the lateness of the hour. But if you note, that is talking about Scott Fisher and the Mountain Madness group, who had left much later than Rob Hall's group and were thus indeed using a 2 p.m. turnaround time. Krakauer then quotes Beitelman for the 2 p.m. turnaround, but again, this appears to be just for the Mountain Madness group. At Rob's suggestion, we decided to enforce a 2 p.m. turnaround time. Anybody who wasn't within spitting distance of the summit by 2 p.m. had to turn around and go down. It appears after repeatedly saying that Rob Hall didn't set the final turnaround time, the time magically just appears as 2 p.m. for both teams because Krakauer didn't summit until after 1 p.m. More problematic is that in Krakauer's magazine article that was written in the period shortly after the events, he quotes Stu Hutchinson saying, "It seemed increasingly unlikely that we would have any chance of summiting before the 1 p.m. turnaround time dictated by Rob." Nowhere in the article is there any mention of a 2 p.m. turnaround, nor that Rob Hall had not actually set the turnaround time. Instead, Krakauer just adds the portion to his book when he realized the problem. The problem is that he himself did not summit until after the 1 p.m. turnaround time. Much of his book is cut and paste from the Outside Magazine article, so when you see a change, you know Krakauer is up to something. In the article, the quote is, "It seemed increasingly unlikely that we would have any chance of summiting before the 1 p.m. turnaround time dictated by Rob." And in the book, the dictated by Rob is dropped from the quote, and a bunch of qualifying explanation is inserted by Krakauer that is completely made up. Into Thin Air is not a piece of journalism where Krakauer is reporting facts to his readers. It is a work of fiction where he, as the Gary Sue main character, alters the fact so that he didn't break the turnaround time. Equally curious is that Krakauer refers to it as a predetermined turnaround time in both the book and the article. In the article, he is clearly referring to the 1 p.m. turnaround time, which was dictated by Rob Hall well in advance of the climb. In the article, there is never any mention of a 2 p.m. time. Then in the book, 2 p.m. shows up as a possibility, and then sometime after the climb began, somehow becomes the predetermined turnaround time, which is impossible. That is not what the word predetermined means. In his analysis section, Krakauer concludes that ignoring the predetermined turnaround times was a significant problem. Certainly, time had as much to do with the tragedy as the weather, and ignoring the clock can't be passed off as an act of God. Delays at the fixed lines were foreseeable and eminently preventable. Predetermined turnaround times were egregiously ignored. But it is Krakauer himself that ignored the Adventure Consultant Group's predetermined 1 p.m. turnaround time. His accounts of Rob Hall not actually setting the turnaround time are contradicted by Michael Groom, Lou Kosiski, and even his own quotation of Stu Hutchinson in the Outside Magazine article. Beck Weathers did not address the turnaround time in his book. So Lou Kosiski, John Tasky, and Stu Hutchinson all turned around because they knew they could not reach the summit by the predetermined 1 p.m. turnaround time. Doug Hansen had turned around much earlier that morning, before the sun even came up. Hansen was moving slowly and decided he just couldn't make it. Lou Kosiski reports Doug Hansen turned around below the balcony. The only thing known is that Rob Hall had some conversation with Doug, and that Doug then resumed climbing. Thus, Krakauer's analysis that predetermined turnaround times were egregiously ignored is a bit misplaced. 6 of the 8 Adventure Consultant clients made the decision to turn around well before the 1 p.m. predetermined turnaround time. Frank Fishbeck had turned around early. He was simply not climbing well and headed back to camp. Beck Weathers became blind and just needed someone to guide him back into camp. The only clients that ignored the turnaround time were Jon Krakauer himself, who just updated it to 2 p.m. so that he would look better in his book, and Yasko Namba. In any case, Namba reached the summit at 2:15, which, if the turnaround time was indeed 2 p.m., is hardly egregious. Doug Hansen was pushed on by Rob Hall when this was clearly the wrong decision. Rob pushing Doug, who made the reasonable decision to turn around, is what killed Rob Hall, Andy Harris, and Doug Hansen. Likely, Yasko Namba would have survived as well. If Rob Hall had let Hansen turn around, Rob Hall could have then assisted Beck Weathers down, and Groom could have focused on Namba. Likely, Namba would have survived, and Weathers would still have his hands. Nor was there any reason for Rob Hall to push Hansen. Hansen had climbed poorly in the icefall, had missed an acclimatization rotation, and stated he was not feeling well that day. There was simply no reason not to let Doug head back to camp. But such a simple analysis doesn't make for a best-selling book. And even worse, Rob Hall had made a deal with Outside Magazine and was paying for Krakauer's climb. Krakauer's writing was nothing more than a corporate product placement for Adventure Consultants, so he couldn't put all the blame on Rob Hall, and there had to be some greater mystery for him to sell all of his books. And while all of this seems perfectly obvious, what does any of it have to do with fixing ropes? Well, Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants' turnaround time was 1 p.m. Thus, at South Summit, Ann Dorje, Rob Hall's lead climbing Sherpa, would know the turnaround time was 1 p.m. There was no reason for any Adventure Consultant Sherpas to fix any new rope above South Summit because the rational expectation is that Rob Hall would turn everyone around at South Summit because none of them could make the 1 p.m. predetermined turnaround time. Krakauer again uses his innuendo technique to imply they waited at South Summit because of some rift between Anne Dorje and Lobsang, but this is nothing more than Krakauer's Western arrogance, which pays lip service to the Sherpa while blatantly ignoring and belittling them. Everyone on South Summit had summit fever. Certainly Krakauer did, as did Bukrev. They all did. Everyone except Anne Dorje. There was simply no way Rob Hall's playing clients could have made the summit by 1 p.m. Anne Dorje would have been aware of the attempt on May 9th where they turned around not much further up the mountain at 1 p.m., and they were only saved by the Sherpa dragging the clients back into camp. The rational thing for any thinking person to do was to turn around at South Summit. For whatever reason, the Adventure Consultants Group had simply climbed too slow. They had started 45 minutes in front of the Mountain Madness team, and already Neil Beitelman reached the South Summit a full 1 hour before the fastest adventure consultant client, that being Jon Krakauer. Having left later than Adventure Consultants, this also meant that at the very least, the Mountain Madness team had 45 minutes of extra oxygen. I will get into the extra oxygen that was available for the Mountain Madness clients in a future video. So if Mountain Madness wanted to press on to the summit, that had nothing to do with Anne Dorje. There was never any agreement that would require a team that had turned around to supply a Sherpa to fix the ropes for a competitor team. It should also be noticed that Anne Dorje was well aware that in 1995, Rob Hall turned all of his clients around at the South Summit at about the exact same time, but only after Lobsang and Guy Cotter, a Western guide, had fixed the rope between the South Summit and the Hillary Step. Not wishing to have a repeat of the previous year, Anne Dorje was simply acting rationally. Anne Dorje had already done the significant amount of work of bringing the rope up to South Summit, and he had already fixed one section of rope below the South Summit. The notion that he would only then get upset at Lobsang and refuse to tie in the rope to a couple more anchor points is the height of Western hubris, saying that the Western guides had to do all the work of fixing the rope. If I had a choice of carrying 150 feet of rope all the way up from South Col to South Summit, or tying it in to 4 or 5 pre-existing anchor points, I would take the job of tying it in every single time. It would only take about 10 minutes. For the rope tying, they used several different types of ropes, but one specifically mentioned by Beitelman was a 7mm Perlon rope, which is just a nylon type of rope. He also mentioned that they used a polypropylene rope of unspecified diameter. The nylon rope would have been the lightest weight at about 3 to 4 pounds for the 60 meters they had. The polypro would be about 5 to 6 pounds for the 150 feet. It does not make any sense that Anne Dorje would have carried the rope all the way to South Summit, and he had just fixed a section of rope below South Summit, and only then would he get upset or tired or whatever excuse Krakauer was implying. Instead, Anne Dorje was the only person on South Summit who was thinking clearly, and he knew that Rob Hall should turn everyone around, as there was no remote possibility the paying clients would make the 1 p.m. predetermined turnaround. So that is the setup for the next video on rope fixing when I get into why the Adventure Consultants team was going so slow and why you can't simply blame the Sherpas for the whole thing the way Krakauer does. As a note, Charlotte Fox passed away in 2018 at age 61, but her account of the 1996 events is still worth reading, as it provides a very different version of events than portrayed in Into Thin Air.